The Seahawks will have a new head coach on the sideline next season, which could have an impact on a number of veterans that are under contract and both hitting free agency as well. Which players have the most at stake based on this new coaching search? We're going to be breaking it all down in our Wednesday edition of Locked On Seahawks.
You are Locked On Seahawks, your daily Seattle Seahawks podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Greetings, 12. This is Corbin Smith, host of the Locked On Seahawks podcast, your daily Seahawks podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Glad to be joined, as always, by my co-host in crime, Rob Rang, and a special thanks to each and every one of the 12s out there, whether you're listening in nearby North Bend, Washington, or down in Flagstaff, Arizona. We greatly appreciate each and every one of you for making Locked On Seahawks your first listen 5 days a week. Before we kick off the show, I just want to give special thanks to each and every one of you valued listeners that has donated to my wife's cancer GoFundMe page over the past few days. We have been absolutely floored by the number of you that have generously given a gift to us to be able to have this surgery so that my wife can hopefully be cancer-free. We're really excited about it. So thank you to each and every one of you for elevating your game when we certainly needed it. So a thank you from the Smith family. We greatly appreciate it. Going back to football, we're going to be continuing our coach profile breakdown. We've got Frank Smith and Ejiro Evero today as our two coaches, one offense, one defense, as we continue that trend. And we're going to look at which veterans could be impacted most by the fact that Pete Carroll will not be on the sideline next season. It's a jam-packed episode, and it's coming your way courtesy of Jace Medical. Empower yourself when you purchase a Jace case, providing you with a personal supply of 5 antibiotics that treat 50-plus infections. Get yours today at jacemedical.com and use the code LOCKEDON to get $20 off your order. That's JASE medical.com. Now for your lead story here on our Wednesday edition of Locked On Seahawks. The Seahawks officially kicked off their interview process today as they try to find a replacement for Pete Carroll. And regardless of who ends up landing that job, whether it's a familiar name like Dan Quinn or a newcomer like maybe Frank Smith, who we're going to be talking about today, regardless of who gets that job, it's a different coach. There's going to be differences in philosophy, and there's going to be differences in the type of players that these coaches are going to want to have on their roster. And so, Rob, you look from a veteran standpoint, the young guys in this team, your Devin Witherspoons, the Rick Woolens, Boye Mafe, you figure whoever takes the job is going to be really excited to have that player on the roster, especially because they are on rookie contracts and they are affordable. But your high-priced veterans, every time there's a coaching move, those players have to be looking in the rearview mirror a little bit, particularly if you've got a cap hit that's north of $15 million. Maybe you're getting to be a little older player. Maybe you don't fit the new coach's scheme. And keeping that in mind, it's time for us to talk about which players maybe have the most at stake right now, because there have to be some veteran players in this team now that are really curious what their future looks like, because Pete Carroll's not going to be here anymore, at least beyond being an advisor. He's going to be the coach, and that does change the dynamic a lot for this roster.
No, it absolutely changes the dynamic, Corbin. I mean, that's the thing, is that, Pete Carroll had developed this reputation, I mean, going back for years and years, and certainly before being the head coach of the Seattle Seahawks, of kind of developing some favorites. And, there's a lot of people out there who would argue that maybe that the preferential treatment that he has shown some of those players over the years has always contributed to Seattle's success and the success of other teams over the years, and also sometimes has contributed to the downfalls of those teams. So I think that when you start looking at some of the veterans on Seattle's roster who do have bloated salaries and perhaps less production than expected, and get to start the conversation off with number 33, the big safety Jamal Adams. And we all know that when he has been on the field, at times we have seen some absolute playmakers playmaking ability, but does it really justify the cost that Seattle gave up to acquire him from the New York Jets those years ago, the salary that he has accumulated since then? I think that he is the obvious player to kind of mention here. And I'll mention a couple of other players that I think that, as far as veterans, that really need to be kind of concerned and very much watching to see who the Seahawks are going to be bringing in as a new head coach. Not only Jamal Adams, but I think the wide receiver Tyler Lockett, I think, has to very much be on notice. Again, this is a player that has been an absolute legend for the Seahawks. But at the same time, when you consider his salary, you consider the fact that, you're going to have a new head coach coming in that maybe isn't going to have the loyalty to Lockett that Pete Carroll had, that I think that he has got to be paying attention. And I mentioned Jamal Adams first, but I want to mention another player in Quandre Diggs. I mean, I just don't know that very many head coaches in the NFL are going to view the salary that Seattle has allocated to their two safeties in Jamal Adams and Quandre Diggs is tenable. I mean, can you actually compete in today's NFL, especially in a division like the NFC West that is as run heavy as this one is? Can you pay that kind of money to those two safeties? So to me, that is a big conversation here. But, before we get too far into this conversation, I think you also have to kind of just mention the low-hanging fruit here about all of those free agents that are, the Seahawks have to make some decisions on, whether it be a guy like a Bobby Wagner, whether it be a guard like a Damian Lewis, who Pete Carroll, the moment that the Seahawks selected him out of LSU, Pete Carroll kind of talked about the fact that, he had a whole bunch of, positive reviews from his former defensive coordinator, Ejiro, who was, of course, the head coach at LSU back in those days. Jordan Brooks, a former first-round pick from Texas Tech, that obviously Pete Carroll had the head position in terms of personnel at that point. There are a lot of players who are free agents. There are a lot of players who are veterans that are currently under contract that once Seattle gets a new head coach here, there could be some major ramifications on the personnel side, not just who's standing on the sideline calling plays or distributing those things to the offensive and defensive coordinators.
You and I are in agreement, and I think that this is a slam dunk on this one, that Jamal Adams has to be number one on this list, because I don't know that there's anybody that has come to bat for him the way that Pete Carroll has the last couple of months, with him sitting out late in the season, with there being concerns about his knee long-term and his contract, and the fact that it can save some money by cutting him as a cap casualty. And Pete Carroll was adamant end of the season that they were not going to be doing that. Well, if Pete Carroll is not involved with your personnel anymore, then clearly whoever the incoming coach, and as you said, the safety costs, the salaries that the Seahawks have at that position, I absolutely think Jamal Adams has to be wondering what my future looks like in Seattle, because there's going to be a new coach. Now, John Schneider's still here. Maybe John Schneider swings a big hammer there now that he controls personnel and he wants to keep Jamal Adams around because he traded for him. But I have a feeling that this is going to be tough sledding to convince a coach that they are going to be keeping him with the salary, the injuries, things of that nature. I've got Geno Smith second on my list, not because I think that he's in danger necessarily losing his job, but it's the most important position in the league. And if you hire a younger coach that says, look, I want my own QB, the Seahawks do have a fairly easy out on that contract. And so that's why he's so high on my list. I think he's going to be the starter next year, but there could be a lot of change in this coaching search. And as far as the other three that I've got here, I've got Draymond Jones and Will Dissly as my next two players, and they're for different reasons. Will Dissly at number 4 is because he's the last year of his contract, $10 million cap hit for a guy that, quite frankly, he's a good player, but he's not going to put many receiving numbers up for you. And I just don't know that another coach is going to come in and say, you know what, this run blocking tight end is super valuable to what I want to do. Now, some of these coordinators may want to keep a player like that around, but you can save over $7 million cutting him or doing some restructuring, re-signing him to a cheaper contract. So he's a player that I think certainly is a little bit on the fence here. And Draymond Jones, you didn't have that impressive of a first season. You've got a bloated salary. Now maybe a new coach coming in will be really excited about him because he's still a young player that's got a long track record of being able to get after quarterbacks. But at the same time, you can save some money by either cutting or trading him. And I think he's certainly on this list. And I've got Lockett at number 5, although I don't think there's going to be anything happening on this front. I still think Tyler Lockett is a really good player, and he is an excellent locker room guy. And I think a lot of the offensive coaches in particular, Seattle's going to be interviewing. I don't think they're going to be rushing to John Schneider saying, hey, we need to move on from this receiver. I don't think that's going to be happening, but he does have a bloated contract. And so there may be some coaches that are looking at this like, hey, John, we need to do something so that we can bring some guys in that I want. That might be a domino that has to fall. So I think that you could make arguments for a number of these guys. And as you mentioned, the free agents, I mean, Bobby Wagner may be appealing to some of these coaching candidates. I think Dan Quinn would love to have him if Dan Quinn is hired. But is somebody like Ejiro Evero, who we're going to be talking about later, is he going to be excited about a 34-year-old linebacker in the middle? We just don't know. Jordan Brooks, what's the mindset going to be for whoever takes this job? These guys are all a little bit in flux here until the Seahawks pick their coach. And so this is very much a tenuous time for veterans on all the teams in the league that are changing coaches right now, including in Seattle. Coming up next, we're going to continue our coach profile segment, and we're going to go to Florida, ironically, where I am at right now. And we're going to talk about Frank Smith, the Dolphins offensive coordinator, who is expected to interview with the Seahawks. We're going to be breaking down why he might be a dark horse to watch in this race to replace Pete Carroll. Don't go away. You're listening to the Wednesday edition of Locked On Seahawks. Now, a word from our sponsor, BetterHelp. Life can be full of twists and turns and throw a few wrenches at you at unexpected times. Take my word for it right now. Sometimes it's important to lead yourself through it all and put a focus on your mental health. BetterHelp Online Therapy will assess your needs and can match you with your own licensed professional therapist in less than 48 hours. Therapy has worked wonders for me over the past few years, dealing with a lot of family-related health issues, but don't just take my word for it. Having someone in your corner to guide you when you're struggling to navigate obstacles can be invaluable. It's not a crisis line. It's not self-help. It's professional therapy done securely online and available to people worldwide. With therapy, it can take a few tries to find the right fit for you. BetterHelp is a great way to invest in yourself, and BetterHelp has a special offer for our listeners. Get 10% off your first month at BetterHelp.com/lockedon. That's 10% off your first month of online therapy at BetterHelp.com/lockedon. This episode is also brought to you by Prize Picks, the largest independently owned daily fantasy sports platform in North America. It's the easiest and most exciting way to play daily fantasy sports. It's just you against the numbers. Instead of battling thousands of other players, it's just you picking more than or less than on 2 to 6 player stat projections, and you can watch the winnings roll in. Prize Picks is so easy to play that you can make your submissions in less than 60 seconds. And now that we're in the playoffs with basketball season going on, you can take part in combo projections in the Specials League. For example, you can have Steph Curry for the Warriors, and you can have him lined up with one of the top receivers for this week's wild card or this week's divisional round. Maybe you can throw Stephon Diggs in there for the Bills, 11.5 3-pointers plus receptions. Prize Picks even offers a reboot policy, so your entries stay in play if one of your players gets injured for football and basketball games. If you have a player who exits in the first half and they don't return in the second half, that player is rebooted. Prize Picks is the only fantasy sports platform out there that has such an injury insurance policy. Prize Picks is an absolute blast each week, and it's an easy way to enjoy daily fantasy without the hassle and land quick winnings. Go to prizepicks.com/LockedOnNFL and use the code LockedOnNFL for a first deposit match up to $100. That's prizepicks.com/LockedOnNFL and use the code LockedOnNFL for a first deposit match up to $100. Prize Picks, daily fantasy sports made easy. You're listening to the Wednesday edition of Locked On Seahawks. I'm your host, Corbin Smith. Glad to be joined, as always, by my co-host in crime, Rob Rang. And a special thanks to each and every one of the 12s tuning in. Thank you for making Locked On Seahawks your first listen 5 days a week. We greatly appreciate it. The Seahawks officially in the midst of their coaching search to replace Pete Carroll. They had their first scheduled interviews starting today. They've got at least 4 interviews scheduled for this week. So some excitement starting to build about who's going to be the successor for Pete Carroll. And there's been all kinds of excitement about Ben Johnson, who we talked about yesterday from the Lions, Bobby Slowick from the Texans, who they now have an interview lined up with. But I think that there is a young offensive coordinator that is in the mix here that maybe isn't getting talked about near enough. And Rob, you and I have both gushed about Frank Smith, and He's been the OC for the Miami Dolphins the last 2 years under Mike McDaniel, who has been a fantastic head coach in Miami. Obviously, a disappointing end of the season for them. They had tons of injuries on both sides of the ball. They just weren't the same team when they got in the playoffs. That's part of the battle. How healthy can you be when you get to the playoffs? But this offense was potent this year, both passing and running the football. And Frank Smith has such a unique background. He's actually an offensive line guy by trade. He was an assistant O-line coach in New Orleans earlier in his career. And during the 5 seasons that he was on staff, the Saints gave up the 3rd fewest sacks in the NFL during that 5-year span. And then Justin Herbert, a couple years ago when he was with the Chargers, was sacked very few times. The Chargers were near the top of the league in fewest sacks allowed. So he's got a very long track record that he's built of developing strong O-lines, both in terms of opening up the passing game and the run game, where the Dolphins had a top 6 rushing attack, and they were as explosive as anybody this year.
They really were. And I think that the easiest thing to do, Corbin, I mean, as a guy who is, went to college to become an English teacher, the easiest thing to do is to sometimes judge a book by its cover. And the man's name is Frank Smith. This is a former walk-on at Miami of Ohio. And when you hear things like that, you think, okay, this is just somebody else. The Seahawks are, other NFL teams are going to be interviewing, but he's not really a head coaching candidate. I would push back against that hard. I really think that if you want the Seahawks to go from an offensive perspective, and maybe there's the head coach, kind of a guy like a Jim Harbaugh, but if you're going to go from a man who has never been the head coach, has only been a coordinator, then Frank Smith might just be my absolute favorite of the bunch, at least from the research that I have done to this point and the conversations that I have had. And you mentioned a couple of the different teams in which he's worked for. Sean Payton with the New Orleans Saints had a great deal of success there. The Los Angeles Chargers the last couple of years, working with a quarterback as dynamic as a Justin Herbert, a running back as dynamic as Austin Eckler, the offensive line that they had there. Previously worked with the Raiders, and he was the tight end coach there and really made a commitment to Darren Waller. And you start mentioning all of these players, Darren Waller, Justin Herbert, a Drew Brees in New Orleans, and you think, okay, well, you're working with the best players in the league. Of course you should have some success. And then you start looking a little bit closer in the absolute best years of the aforementioned players I just said, Brees, Herbert, Eckler, Waller. The best years of their careers were when Frank Smith was the head coach, or was the play caller, not the play caller, but the positional coach for those particular players. And I love the fact that you mentioned the offensive line component of this. He actually played in the offensive line at Miami, Ohio. Kind of a side note here, he was a blocker for Ben Roethlisberger way back in the day. I just think that when you are a former offensive line coach, then you understand the team commitment element to the game. We talked about this before with special teams coaches. I think that Frank Smith provides that. And similar to what I did in yesterday's episode, kind of read off a quote that Sean McVay, obviously the LA Rams head coach, had to say about his current defensive coordinator and Raheem Morris. I'm going to read a quote from Mike McDaniels, excuse me. I always screw up names, guys. I apologize. But Mike McDaniels, the current Miami Dolphins head coach, who is the play caller. It's important to mention that for the Miami Dolphins. And it's not just a good offense the Miami Dolphins had. It's an absolutely historic offense that the Miami Dolphins had. And they faced not only a very good team in the Kansas City Chiefs, but also obviously frigid conditions when they went on the road to play Kansas City this past week. But I'm just going to read you this quote because to me, it says everything that you need to know about Frank Smith and why the Seahawks and every other NFL team out there absolutely needs to interview this young man. I say young man, he's 42 years old, but still, I think that he's kind of in the prime of his career. I do think that he is going to be a head coach and possibly a very, very good one here soon. Again, here is his quote. This is from Mike McDaniels, the head coach of the Miami Dolphins. And I think that he's among the most articulate coaches I've ever heard. But this is his quote. It says he talking about, of course, Frank Smith. He has a thorough understanding of the game as a great teacher, which is really what coaching is all about. He also has a unique ability to anticipate problems before they arise, be that on the field or in administrative type things related to schedules, questions that come up with players or coaches, etc. He operates on a daily basis with a passion, a positivity, and a humility that is rare and sets him apart. It's hard for me, again, this is Mike McDaniels, head coach of the Miami Dolphins. It is hard for me to summarize the positive impact that Frank has had on our team and our coaching staff, and especially in supporting me as a head coach. I didn't know Frank when I hired him, but what drew me to him is that I knew from shared connections and through seeing the product on the field from his players that he exhibits what a coach, in my opinion, Mike McDaniel's opinion, should be. Someone who is committed to helping players become the best version of themselves and putting them in position to succeed. He does that through a relentless passion for the details, technique, and making sure all the little things are done right. But he's effective because of the way that he connects with them as a human being. He's invested in their development in every way and builds trust as a result. Corbin, we talked previously about the absolute focus that Jody Allen, as owner of the Seattle Seahawks, put on John Schneider as general manager and, chief poobah of the Seattle Seahawks, that there is a commitment to the culture. Frank Smith checks that box like very few others. I do think if his name was something a little bit more dynamic than Frank Smith, I think that he would be at the top of a lot of fans' lists. I'm telling you right now, Frank Smith should be somebody the Seahawks fans out there should be paying attention to, because I do believe that he is going to be a very successful head coach. Wouldn't be at all surprised if he is trading his current colors for the silver, blue, and green that is the Seattle Seahawks in a very short amount of time.
I think that he is a coaching candidate that fans need to take very seriously. And you just mentioned a couple of reasons why. Head coach is not just about X's and O's. We've seen a lot of X's and O's related coaches that was a strength that really struggled as head coaches, because there's so much more to it. You've got to be able to juggle all the other tasks. You are running a business. You got to be able to instill culture, which this guy, if you've watched his interviews, he's as impressive as anybody in press conferences with the way he carries himself. He is a teacher first and foremost, which I think is critical. Being a head coach and being able to have accountability with your assistants. He's done a lot of different jobs in the NFL, and he's been really good at all of them. Very similar to Dave Canales in that sense, that it just seems like whatever hat he's had on, he's very successful. And so this is a guy that I think makes a lot of sense. And from an X's and O's standpoint, there's other things about it that I think are really exciting. And most notably, for Seahawks fans that have been disappointed with the lack of two-back usage in the last 9 or 10 years, the Miami Dolphins were first in the NFL this year in two-back sets, 21 personnel. So they will run fullbacks. They will have 2 running backs on the field. They will mix and match where they use them. They'll move some of them out to receiver, but they ran 21 personnel more than 40% of the time. And oh, by the way, they also run a ton of I-form with 2 guys in the backfield, almost 10% of their plays, which in today's NFL, that's a lot. That was the 6th highest percentage. So I think from that perspective, and also the standpoint that, as we talked about with Ben Johnson yesterday, this is another offense. Even if Frank Smith is not the one that's calling the plays, he is involved with coordinating this offense. He is involved with getting them game plan ready for the season or for the upcoming week. He is involved in all that implementation leading up to game day, and he's been a run game coordinator in the NFL. He's got the offensive line background. They were one of the best play action teams in the league. They were a zone-heavy run team, but man, were they good at it. 6th in the NFL in rushing yards this year, explosive run plays. They get guys into big creases and explosive plays. Imagine doing that with Ken Walker III and Zach Charbonnet. So I think when you consider the entire package here, and yes, Mike McDaniel has a huge bearing on that with his offensive mind, but as he said in that quote he read off, like how the impact has been behind the scenes, how big of an impact it has been from Frank Smith. This guy absolutely deserves to be in the discussion as one of the favorites to land this job. And I could see him coming in an interview with John Schneider, Jody Allen and company and winning over them. He might not be that name that is the sexy hire out there right now, but I'll tell you what, if the Seahawks made a move to bring this guy in, I'd be excited about it if I'm a Seahawks fan, because you're bringing in a guy with great O-line history, which that's been the issue for a long time in Seattle. You team him up with the young talent they've got in that O-line right now and his ability to develop a run game, protect the quarterback. If Geno Smith got more time, there's a chance that your passing game is a top 5 passing game in the NFL next year. This is a guy that should very much be on the radar for the Seahawks big time as they try to replace Pete Carroll. We're going to shift gears to defense next with Evero, who coached for the Carolina Panthers last year. He was with the Broncos the year before, an experienced defensive coordinator. He was a safeties coach with the Rams as well, so a familiar NFC West face. Could he be a potential candidate to take over for Pete Carroll with that defensive mindset? We'll be breaking him down coming up next year on our Wednesday edition of Locked On Seahawks. This episode is brought your way by Jace Medical. I know we come to talk sports here and escape from some of the crazy realities of real life, but let's take a moment here to discuss real life, because according to the FDA, pharmacies are running out of antibiotics like amoxicillin, and that is a scary prospect. I can't imagine a more helpless feeling than if my wife or one of my family members gets sick, and then we've got supply chain issues that prevent them from getting the medication they need. Thankfully, that's not an issue because of Jace Medical. The Jace case is a pack of 5 different antibiotics to treat a long list of bacterial illnesses, whether it's UTIs, sinusitis, skin infections, among others. This stuff can happen to each and every one of us. Visit jacemedical.com and complete your physician encounter. It'll be reviewed by a board-certified physician, and your medications will be dispensed by a licensed pharmacy at a fraction of the regular cost. It's never been more important to be prepared than today. Go to jacemedical.com and use the offer code LOCKEDON to get 20% off your order. You're listening to the Wednesday edition of Locked On Seahawks. This is your host, Corbin Smith. Glad to be joined, as always, by my co-host in crime, Rob Rang. And a special thanks to each and every one of the 12s out there. Thank you for making Locked On Seahawks your first listen 5 days a week. We greatly appreciate it. Make sure to check out the brand new Locked On 24/7 streaming channel on YouTube. Locked On Sports Today is here for your 24/7 coverage with the top sports stories of the day. Local experts from Locked On, plus our national shows covering every league. Go to Locked On Sports Today on YouTube and subscribe to the first ever national sports 24/7 streaming channel. All right, Rob, let's shift gears with our coaching profiles. We just talked about Frank the Tank Smith, who is one of my dark horses in this coaching carousel that I think could make a lot of sense for the Seahawks. But let's go to the defensive side of the ball with a coach who I was really surprised did not land a head coaching job during the cycle last year with what he did with the Denver Broncos as the defensive coordinator a couple of seasons ago. That year that was a disaster for Nathaniel Hackett. The first year in Denver for Russell Wilson was an unmitigated disaster, and yet that defense for the Broncos was really good. So Evero got some head coaching interviews last year. He got to kick the tires a little bit, but ultimately he ended up withdrawing his name from a few of the positions he interviewed for, and the Carolina Panthers brought him on Frank Reich's staff as the defensive coordinator, holding the same position with Carolina. It was a really difficult year all the way around for the Panthers. You look statistically on defense, this was not a good defense for the Carolina Panthers, but you also have to consider, Rob, the circumstances made it near impossible for this defense to really be able to get the job done because of just how inept the offense was for really the entire season.
Yeah, you just kind of set up the tee for me right there, buddy. I mean, I appreciate that. And that's exactly the point, is that, sure, it's kind of similar to what we just talked about a moment ago with Frank Smith. Don't judge a book by its cover. You may not be able to pronounce the man's name, just said Ejiro. It's actually a very simple name to pronounce. It rhymes. But it really is about the fact, the leadership, the consistency, the camaraderie that he helped create despite some really difficult circumstances that he had as a defensive coordinator with the Denver Broncos. Nathaniel Hackett gets fired midway through the season. Then in the Carolina Panthers, where Frank Reich gets fired midway through the season, and Evero's defense was still able to put up some pretty damn impressive numbers and keep his respective team competitive. And this is not, he's been the defensive coordinator, as I mentioned, in Denver and in Carolina the past 2 seasons. He has been a coach in the NFL the past 16 seasons. And you start looking at some of the coaches in which that he has worked under. I mean, guys who have won Super Bowls like a John Gruden or, Sean McVay, of course. He had 5 seasons in 5 seasons in San Francisco with Jim Harbaugh. He had 6 seasons, with the LA Rams, including winning the Super Bowl. This is one of those coaches that is not only very, very good in the secondary, which of course was Pete Carroll's specialty. And so there would be some continuity from that side, if that's what you were looking for. He also is somebody that is, has worked with a lot of different people. And again, is known for his leadership ability, his calm on the sideline. That's one of the things that, again, if you are trying to build culture, then I really think that Evero makes an awful lot of sense from a Seahawk perspective. This is a good football coach. I mean, if you're going to put the proverbial gun to my head, I am more excited about Frank Smith, frankly. I think that Evero has done a really good job, but at the same time, I also think that there are some troubling numbers that you have to acknowledge with what he has done. 32nd in sacks this past season, 32nd in turnovers forced this past season, 32nd in rushing touchdowns allowed for the Carolina Panthers. So you hear things like that, and there people are going to be running for the woods saying, why would you even consider a man like this? I'll tell you why. Because you look at what the cards that he was dealt, as you alluded to a moment ago, Corbin, and the fact that he is still among the most prioritized head coaching candidates in all of the NFL. To me, this is exactly what John Schneider said in his press conference that he was going to do. They are going to explore. They are going to learn. Ejiro Evero is one of those head coaching candidates who is on the ascent. And I think that it is a mistake if people just look at statistics and think that, oh, this guy cannot be a head coach. The track record says the exact opposite. He is absolutely somebody that teams are taking very seriously. He has a great deal of loyalty from the former coaches and former players that have worked with him. And as you, again, referenced here, he is somebody who has shown a willingness to turn past other job opportunities to do with what he believes is the right thing to do. And I think that the integrity that he is demonstrating and the coaching perspective is something that is absolutely going to appeal to John Schneider and Jody Allen as well.
I love the fact you mentioned continuity. Seahawks fans want something different, but at the same time, if you can bring in a defensive coach that does have a background with secondary players, he was a safeties coach with the Rams for several years, Evero was. Last year, the Panthers ran cover 3, the 6th or 8th most. Cover 4, they ran the 6th most. So they ran a lot of middle field open and middle field closed concepts. So you're seeing a coach that has been diverse schematically. There's been more disguised coverages. Again, that seems to be something that's being emphasized. When you look at all the defensive candidates Seattle's looking at, you're looking at coaches that have done a better job of mixing up their looks pre-snap than what the Seattle Seahawks did the 2 years that Clint Hurt was defensive coordinator. And quite frankly, under Pete Carroll for a long time, Legion of Boom, they didn't need to very much because that secondary was so good. That defense was so dominant, but you don't have that group anymore. You need coaches that can disguise, that can really confuse the quarterback on the other side and make reading the defense much more difficult. And I think the other thing that's interesting about Evero is the aggressiveness factor. And some of this is because the Panthers just couldn't get after the quarterback last year, but they blitzed the 4th highest rate in the NFL last year. They were 3rd in passing defense. That is still a stat that I'm going to be circling any day of the week and saying, okay, I need somebody that can coach up a passing defense like that. And they did that without much of a pass rush. So imagine if he could come to Seattle with some of the young pass rushers they've got, like Boye Mafe. You've got a chance to dramatically improve that and not have to be quite as aggressive getting after the quarterback. They also were 11th in sim pressures. That is another thing. We've talked about every one of these defensive coordinator candidates that's being looked at right now. They are high on that sim pressure ranking. We looked already at Mike McDonald. They were 1st. And then yesterday when we were discussing Raheem Morris, another coach that was in the top 10, just outside the top 10 at number 11 for Evero. And I think that would have been a higher percentage if they didn't have to send blitzers so much this year. I would expect with a better defense and a better offense to complement that he's going to do sim pressures at an even higher rate than what we saw this last season. So I think there's a lot to like about this guy as a candidate. I can see the numbers scaring away some fans, but just remember 2 years ago, if the Denver Broncos offense would have been competent at all, that team probably wins 9 or 10 games and is a potential playoff team because the defense kept them in games. They had one of the best scoring defenses in the league. And without that Rams blowout that ended up ultimately getting Hackett fired, you take that game out, they would have finished in the top 3 in scoring defense. That was a very good defense, a lot of good talented players. Evero is a really good coach. I would agree with you that I'm actually more excited about Frank Smith of these two, but I could see Evero being a coach that makes a lot of sense for the Seahawks. He's still a fairly young coach that's been in the league for a long time. He's well respected. He's worked for some great head coaches. You mentioned Gruden, McVay, worked for Harbaugh for a while. I mean, he has been with some outstanding coaches with different backgrounds. So he's got that pedigree working for him. So I certainly could see him being somebody that the Seahawks are enamored by. We'll just have to see how he handles the interview process this time around after not taking a head coaching job during the coaching cycle last year. As always, you can follow me on X and Threads at Corbin Smith NFL. You can follow Rob at Rob Rang. Subscribe and follow Locked On Seahawks on YouTube and wherever you get your podcast to make sure you don't miss a single episode. Coming up tomorrow, we'll have 2 more coaching candidates, another one on offense, another one on defense. Going to be breaking down everything you need to know from coverages, from schemes, from rankings, everything you need to know about a potential Seahawks head coach in 2024. You won't want to miss it. Enjoy the rest of your Wednesday, and thanks for listening in. Go Hawks.